Imagine stepping onto a flight only to have your seat snatched by someone who thinks they're more important than you. Now picture the look on their face when they find out the person they just disrespected isn't just a passenger, he's the owner of the entire airline. Stay tuned, because this story is going to leave you speechless. The cabin lights glowed softly as passengers shuffled into their seats, stowing bags in overhead bins and settling in for the flight. Marcus Reed, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and tailored slacks, walked with quiet confidence down the aisle. He carried only a sleek black laptop bag, his movements calm, his expression unreadable. To anyone watching, he looked like an ordinary traveler, perhaps a businessman heading to a meeting, but there was an unmistakable steadiness in the way he carried himself, as though nothing in this environment could rattle him. He glanced down at his ticket, noted the row number, and stopped in front of his assigned seat in business class. But as his eyes fell on the seat, he paused. Sitting there already, legs crossed, designer handbags sprawled across the armrest, and scarf draped like a flag of ownership, was a woman who clearly had no intention of moving. Victoria Hayes sat back in the seat as if it had always belonged to her. Her perfectly styled blonde hair framed a sharp face that carried an expression of entitlement. She tapped on her phone with one hand while sipping sparkling water with the other, giving the impression that her comfort outweighed anyone else's needs. Marcus leaned slightly forward, his voice calm but clear, and said, "Excuse me. I believe you're in my seat." Victoria didn't even look up at first, her eyes glued to her phone. When she finally did glance his way, her gaze was laced with annoyance, as though she'd been interrupted by someone unworthy of her time. "No, I don't think so," she said curtly, her voice carrying enough volume to catch the attention of nearby passengers. "This is my seat. You'll have to find another one in the back." A murmur rippled through the cabin as passengers began to notice the brewing conflict. Some leaned back in their chairs, curious to see how it would play out. Others exchanged quiet whispers, the way strangers do when drama unfolds in close quarters. Marcus remained composed, his tone steady as he replied, "I'm certain this is my seat. Perhaps we should check the tickets." His suggestion was logical, his demeanor unshaken, but Victoria's eyes narrowed, and she let out a small laugh that carried more disdain than humor. "You must be mistaken," she said, her words dripping with condescension. "People like me don't get things like this wrong." Marcus didn't flinch. He simply held up his boarding pass, displaying the seat number clearly printed in bold. Before he could say another word, a flight attendant approached. Sarah, her auburn hair tied neatly into a bun, had been monitoring the situation from a few rows down. She offered a polite smile that carried the weariness of someone used to resolving disputes mid-flight. "Is there a problem here?" she asked softly, hoping to diffuse the growing tension. Marcus handed her his ticket without hesitation. His expression calm, almost patient. Sarah glanced at it, then turned toward Victoria. "Ma'am, this is indeed his assigned seat," she said gently. The words should have ended the matter, but instead they ignited Victoria's indignation. She straightened her posture, her voice rising louder than necessary. "That's impossible," she snapped. "I booked this seat, and I will not be treated like I don't belong here. I've traveled business class all my life, and I know where I sit." Her words carried across the cabin, drawing even more eyes and quiet gasps from those who couldn't believe what they were hearing. Sarah attempted to reason with her, showing Victoria the ticket and politely suggesting she find her actual seat. But Victoria waved her hand dismissively, as though the facts themselves were beneath her. Turning back to Marcus, she narrowed her eyes and added a sharper edge to her tone. "Why don't you be reasonable and move to the back? It's more fitting." The pause before her last words was deliberate, a subtle dagger meant to slice beneath the surface. Some passengers stiffened in their seats, recognizing the unspoken jab, while others looked away, uncomfortable with the ugly undertone. Marcus, however, remained unshaken. He didn't raise his voice or show the slightest flicker of anger. His calm presence only highlighted the ugliness of her outburst. Sarah glanced between them, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. She wanted to resolve this quietly, to avoid further embarrassment for everyone involved, but Victoria's stubbornness was creating a wall no reason could breach. The surrounding passengers leaned closer, some recording discreetly on their phones. Sensing that this was no ordinary argument over seating, there was something heavier in the air, an unspoken clash of entitlement against quiet dignity. Marcus finally spoke again, his voice carrying the same measured calm it had from the start. "Ma'am, the ticket is clear. I'll give you another moment to gather your things." The simplicity of his words contrasted sharply with Victoria's growing agitation. Her cheeks flushed as she realized the attention of nearly the entire business-class cabin was on her. Yet rather than back down, she doubled down, her pride refusing to let her concede. "This is outrageous," she barked. "I won't be told where I can or cannot sit. I paid for luxury, and I will not be moved. If the airline has a problem, they can deal with me directly." The tension thickened, silence wrapping around the confrontation like a shroud. Passengers exchanged glances, some sympathetic toward Marcus, others shaking their heads at Victoria's brazen display. Sarah, caught between protocol and the escalating scene, tried once more to coax Victoria out of the seat, but Victoria folded her arms and planted herself firmly, like a queen refusing to leave her throne. Marcus, still calm, still collected, remained standing beside the seat that was rightfully his, the picture of quiet strength. He did not argue, did not raise his tone, but the weight of his presence was undeniable. Every second that passed only highlighted the contrast between her loud entitlement and his steady composure. What the other passengers didn't yet know was that the man standing before them was not just a businessman with a boarding pass. He was the man who controlled the airline itself. But for now, he let the moment stretch, his calmness turning the scene into a silent lesson, while Victoria continued to expose her arrogance for everyone to see. Victoria's voice rose sharply, slicing through the low murmur of the cabin as she leaned back in the seat she had claimed. "He must have been upgraded by mistake," she declared, her tone dripping with condescension, as if the very idea of Marcus legitimately belonging in business class was absurd. The passengers around her stiffened, some casting quick glances at Marcus to see how he would react. Her words weren't just about a seat. They carried an edge that implied business class was reserved for a certain kind of person, and Marcus wasn't it. She tilted her chin upward, her voice projecting as though she wanted everyone to hear. "People like me are the ones who truly belong here. Not others." Marcus stood tall, his calm presence an unshakable contrast to her performance. He didn't flinch or bristle at her words. He simply looked down at her with quiet authority, as if her tantrum were no more than background noise. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and polite. "This is my seat. I'm asking you again. Please move." His restraint only made Victoria bristle more, as though his composure were an insult. She rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. "No!" she snapped. "I'm not moving. I don't care what that little ticket says. I've worked too hard, and I will not be shoved aside." Flight attendant Sarah stood beside them, her hands nervously clasped, caught between doing her job and trying not to escalate the situation further. She glanced around the cabin, acutely aware that dozens of eyes were fixed on the confrontation. Some passengers were beginning to sigh, annoyed at the delay, while others had discreetly raised their phones, recording every second. Sarah's training told her to resolve conflicts calmly, but Victoria's refusal and Marcus's insistence had pushed the situation into dangerous territory. As the tension thickened, the cockpit door opened and a tall man in uniform stepped out. Captain Harris, with silver streaks in his neatly trimmed hair and a steady authority in his stride, entered the aisle. His presence immediately drew attention. Conversations hushed, and even Victoria paused, her expression flickering for the briefest moment before she put on a charming smile. "Finally," she said, as though he were her ally arriving to save her. "Captain, thank goodness you're here. There's been some ridiculous mistake. This man is trying to take my seat, but I belong here. I always fly business class. I'm sure you understand." She softened her tone deliberately, her posture shifting as she attempted to use charm to manipulate the situation. She leaned slightly toward him, her voice syrupy and conspiratorial. "I'm friends with some very important people in your company. I'd hate for this misunderstanding to cause trouble for anyone." The implication was clear. She was trying to intimidate the captain with supposed connections. Captain Harris listened patiently, his expression unreadable. Then he turned toward Marcus, who handed him the boarding pass without hesitation. A quick glance was all the captain needed to confirm the truth. He looked back at Victoria, his tone clipped but professional. "Ma'am, this is Mr. Reed's seat. You will need to move to the seat listed on your ticket." His words were calm, but firm enough to leave no room for negotiation. A ripple of relief passed through the passengers who had grown tired of the standoff, but Victoria's face twisted with outrage. She leaned forward, her voice rising again. "This is unacceptable. Do you have any idea who I am? I am not someone you can just order around. If you force me to move, I'll be filing a complaint with airline management. Believe me, they'll listen to me." She spat the words out, as though they were a threat meant to frighten everyone into submission. Captain Harris's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Marcus finally broke his silence with a line so quiet and deliberate that it carried more weight than any of Victoria's shouting. His eyes fixed on her, his voice calm and almost casual. "You really don't want to do that." The words hung in the air like a sudden drop in temperature, their meaning unclear but heavy enough to make the passengers lean in closer. The tone wasn't threatening, yet it carried a certainty that made it impossible to dismiss. Victoria blinked at him, then let out a short, dismissive laugh. "What's that supposed to mean?" she scoffed, tossing her hair back with forced bravado. "You think you can scare me with cryptic little warnings? Please, I know a bluff when I hear one." She turned her attention back to the captain, as if Marcus's quiet authority didn't matter, her laughter echoing through the cabin in a way that sounded more nervous than confident. But while Victoria laughed, the passengers shifted in their seats, glancing at Marcus with a curiosity they couldn't explain. Something in his tone, in his presence, suggested he wasn't bluffing at all. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't threatened her, but the assurance in his words hinted at a truth none of them yet knew. Suspense filled the air, and the cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see just how far Victoria's arrogance would take her, and how Marcus's calm strength would unravel it. Victoria's face burned with stubborn pride as she crossed, her arms tighter across her chest, glaring at Marcus as though she could will him into submission. "I am not moving," she hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet hum of the cabin. "If this airline knows what's good for them, they'll move him somewhere else. He doesn't belong here. I do." She gestured dramatically toward Marcus, as if the sheer force of her entitlement could rewrite the truth printed on the boarding pass in his hand. A few passengers groaned audibly, fed up with the scene, while others leaned in with phones held steady, determined to capture every second. Marcus, however, didn't argue. He didn't scold, shout, or match her arrogance with anger. Instead, he slid one hand into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out his phone. His movements were slow, deliberate, unshaken by her venom. He tapped the screen a few times, lifted it to his ear, and spoke in the same calm, measured tone he had carried from the beginning. "Yes," he said simply. "We'll need to fix a customer service issue on Flight 237. Then he ended the call as casually as if he had been confirming a dinner reservation. The action puzzled the passengers, even Sarah and Captain Harris. The line had been vague, almost cryptic, but the composure with which Marcus spoke carried weight. Victoria let out another laugh, high-pitched and mocking. "What was that supposed to be?" she sneered. "Calling a friend to complain? Go ahead, I told you. I have friends, too. Important ones. And when they hear about this humiliation, it won't be me who regrets it." She smirked, confident in her own imagined influence, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes she couldn't hide. Minutes ticked by, the tension in the cabin stretched so tight it was as though even the hum of the engines had quieted. Then Captain Harris's handheld device buzzed with a new notification. He glanced at the screen casually at first, but the moment his eyes landed on the name displayed, his entire demeanor shifted. His brows lifted slightly, and his jaw tightened in recognition. He turned the screen toward Sarah, who gasped audibly, one hand flying to her mouth as her eyes flicked between the device and Marcus. The name glowing on the message was clear. Marcus Reed, majority owner and chief executive officer of the Airline. The realization rippled like electricity through the crew. Sarah's posture changed instantly, the nervousness replaced with a mix of awe and embarrassment. She turned toward Marcus with wide eyes, her voice trembling. "Mr. Reed, we are so sorry. We didn't realize—" Captain Harris stepped forward too, his voice low and apologetic. "Sir, please forgive the delay. We'll handle this immediately." "Damn," murmurs began among the passengers, spreading from one row to the next like wildfire. "He owns the airline?" someone whispered. "Did you hear that?" another muttered. "He's the CEO?" The whispers grew louder, some passengers letting out small gasps, others shaking their heads in disbelief. A few even began to clap, the sound hesitant at first but quickly swelling as admiration filled the cabin. The applause wasn't just for Marcus's title. It was for the dignity with which he had endured the humiliation. Victoria, meanwhile, sat frozen, her face draining of color as the truth sank in. The man she had mocked, dismissed, and degraded as unworthy not only belonged in business class, he literally controlled the company that had given her the privilege of flying there. Her mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time since the confrontation began, her confidence faltered. She stammered, her voice thin and shaky. I didn't know. I didn't mean what I said. It came out wrong." She fumbled. For excuses, her earlier arrogance collapsing into pitiful attempts at justification. Marcus's gaze remained fixed on her, calm and unflinching. He didn't revel in her humiliation, didn't smirk or mock her the way she had mocked him. Instead, he let a heavy silence fill the air before speaking, his voice steady and resonant. "You stole my seat," he said quietly, the words cutting sharper than any raised shout. "But the truth is, you don't just disrespect me. You disrespected every person who's ever been judged unfairly for how they look." His words landed with weight, echoing through the cabin. The passengers who had been filming lowered their phones slightly, some nodding, others sitting in reflective silence. Victoria's eyes darted around, desperate for someone to defend her, but there was no sympathy left in the room. Even those who had been indifferent now looked at her with disdain, the applause swelling again as Marcus's quiet power settled over the cabin. Sarah's voice broke the silence, soft but firm. "Mr. Reed, we'll make sure you're comfortable, and again, we're deeply sorry." Marcus gave her a small nod, acknowledging her sincerity, before turning his attention back to his seat, the one that had been his all along. Victoria remained frozen, her hands trembling as the reality of what she had done pressed down on her. For once, the woman who demanded the spotlight wished nothing more than to disappear into the shadows. The cabin hung in silence after Marcus's quiet but powerful words. Every eye was fixed on him, waiting for what he would do next. Victoria sat rigid, her face pale, her lips parted as though she might try again to defend herself, but the weight of her humiliation kept her frozen. Marcus didn't gloat, didn't savor the moment of her defeat. Instead, he turned calmly to Captain Harris and Sarah, his voice steady and unshaken. "Kindly find her another flight," he said. "My passengers deserve peace." The words were simple, yet they carried the authority of a man who understood true leadership. He didn't ask for revenge, didn't insist on punishment. He demanded only dignity, for himself, for the crew, and for everyone watching. "Captain." Harris nodded immediately, his tone clipped with respect. "Understood, sir." Sarah moved forward, her voice polite but firm as she addressed Victoria. "Ma'am, I'll need you to collect your belongings. We'll arrange another flight." "For you." The woman who had once barked orders and proclaimed her superiority suddenly seemed small, her confidence shattered. Trembling, she reached for her handbag and scarf, fumbling as she shoved them into her arms. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, not sympathetic, but sharp with judgment. A few passengers held their phones high, capturing the moment as Victoria rose from the seat she had clung to so stubbornly. As she walked down the aisle, the click of her heels was drowned out by the quiet buzz of passengers whispering. Some shook their heads, others smirked, but most simply watched in silence, their cameras rolling as the woman who had proclaimed herself above everyone else was escorted out. She tried to hold her head high, but the redness creeping across her cheeks betrayed her embarrassment. Once she reached the door of the aircraft, she glanced back one last time, her eyes meeting Marcus's calm gaze. There was no anger in his expression, no smug satisfaction, only the steady composure of a man who had never once lost control of the situation. That, more than anything, crushed her. When the door closed behind her, a collective sigh seemed to pass through the cabin. The tension that had clung to every corner dissipated, replaced with relief and quiet admiration. Passengers turned toward Marcus, some smiling, others nodding in respect. A man a few rows back whispered to his wife, "That's something we'll never forget." Another leaned across the aisle, shaking his head in awe. He handled that better than anyone else could. The applause that had begun earlier started again, louder this time, with a handful of passengers clapping openly until the sound filled the space. Marcus simply inclined his head, acknowledging them with grace, but not basking in the attention. The flight finally prepared for departure. Marcus settled into his rightful seat, setting his laptop bag neatly at his feet, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. He didn't lean back with triumph or pride. He simply carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had defined him from the start. Flight attendant Sarah passed by his seat, pausing to whisper softly, "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Reed. The way you handled this, it taught me something about professionalism." Her eyes carried genuine gratitude, not just for the way he had endured the ordeal, but for the way he had elevated everyone around him by his example. Marcus gave her a small nod, his response measured but kind. As the plane lifted into the sky, the buzz of whispers continued. Passengers leaned toward each other, replaying the confrontation in hushed voices. Some described the way Victoria's arrogance had crumbled. Others marveled at Marcus's calm restraint. A man in the back remarked that he would be telling this story for years, while another said it was proof that real power doesn't shout. It speaks softly and still commands attention. The flight itself was smooth, but the memory of what had happened lingered, becoming an unshakable part of the experience for everyone on board. By the time the plane landed hours later, clips of the incident had already begun circulating online. Passengers who had recorded Victoria's outburst and Marcus's calm response uploaded them to social media, where the videos spread like wildfire. Within hours, millions had seen the footage, flooding the internet with comments praising Marcus. Words like class, dignity, and power appeared again and again as people across the world admired how he had handled the confrontation without ever raising his voice. The story dominated headlines, becoming a symbol of grace, under pressure and proof that arrogance always crumbles in the face of true strength. The airline itself quickly released a statement, one that bore Marcus's influence. It spoke of respect, equality, and the importance of treating every passenger with dignity, no matter who they were. The message was clear. The company would not tolerate disrespect, and the way its CEO had handled the incident was an example of the values they intended to uphold. The world applauded not just Marcus as a leader, but also the lesson his composure had taught. In the end, the confrontation became more than just a viral story about a seat on a plane. It became a parable about arrogance and humility, entitlement, and respect. The passengers who had witnessed it firsthand carried the memory with them, while millions more found inspiration in the footage online. And through it all, Marcus remained the same, calm, steady, grounded in who he was. He didn't need to boast about his title or remind anyone of his power. His very presence had spoken louder than any declaration. The moral was clear, woven into the final narration of the story. Power isn't in showing off. It's in knowing who you are, even when others can't see it. Marcus didn't just own the airline, he owned the moment.